Margaret Holloway travels 1,000 miles to marry a man who rejects her on sight for being too fat, only to catch the attention of a widowed carpenter who sees beyond society's cruel judgments. When a public confrontation forces Daniel to call her his wife before they've even properly courted, will Margaret finally believe she deserves to be loved for exactly who she is? Blood drained from Margaret Holloway's face as she watched the man who promised to marry her walk away across the train platform. His back stiff, his goodbye hasty. She didn't need to hear the whispers from nearby passengers to know why. Her sighs had turned another suitor cold. The Montana train station buzzed with activity as porters shouted and steam hissed from the massive engine. Margaret stood frozen, her worn leather bag heavy in her grip. She had sold everything back in Boston for this chance. A fresh start with a husband who had seemed kind in his letters. Now what would she do? "Miss, you can't stand there all day," a porter said, pushing a cart dangerously close to her skirts. Margaret stepped aside, her eyes burning with unshed tears. 28 years old, unmarried, 1,000 miles from home, and now, abandoned in a strange town where she knew no one. The wind cut through her wool coat like knives, much sharper than any New England breeze she'd known. Her stomach growled, reminding her she hadn't eaten since early morning. But food would have to wait. She needed shelter first. "Excuse me," she asked the ticket master. "Could you direct me to a respectable boarding house?" The man barely glanced up. "Peterson's. 3 blocks down. Turn right at the Mercantile." Margaret squared her shoulders and lifted her chin. She wouldn't let these strangers see her cry. Back home, the wealthy ladies had whispered behind fans about her figure, her plain face, her lack of suitors. Poor Margaret, they'd say, loud enough for her to hear. Such a burden to carry so much weight in a world that values delicacy. As a girl, she'd believed things would change when she grew up. That someone would see past her appearance to the person inside who loved books and music, who could manage a household with skill, who longed to be a mother. But at 28, those dreams had withered like flowers in frost. Until Richard Tanner's advertisement in the Matrimonial Gazette. Businessman seeks educated wife for companionship and help managing household. Age 25 to 30 preferred. Send correspondence to Oak Ridge, Montana Territory. Their letters had flowed for months. Richard described his hardware store, his plans to expand, his desire for an intelligent partner. Margaret shared her love of literature, her skill with numbers, her hope for children. Not once had he asked about her appearance, and not once had she volunteered that information. Now she trudged down the dusty main street, her boots already showing a layer of Montana dirt. The April sky threatened rain, dark clouds gathering over distant mountains. Everything about this place felt foreign. The wide open spaces after Boston's crowded streets, the rough-hewn buildings instead of brick and stone, the curious stares from townspeople unaccustomed to new faces. The Mercantile appeared ahead, a 2-story building with a painted sign swinging in the wind. Margaret turned right as instructed and spotted a neat white house with a sign reading, "Peterson's Boarding House. Clean rooms, fair rates." Her knock was answered by a plump woman with kind eyes and gray-streaked hair. "Can I help you, dear?" "I need a room," Margaret said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Just for a few days until I can arrange passage back east." Mrs. Peterson's gaze was sharp but not unkind. "Come in out of that wind. You look half frozen and wholly heartbroken." She ushered Margaret into a warm parlor that smelled of baking bread and furniture polish.
"I'm Harriet Peterson."
"And you are?" "Margaret Holloway. I've come from Boston." "All alone? That's quite a journey for a lady." Margaret swallowed hard. "I wasn't supposed to be alone. I was to be met by—" Her voice faltered. Understanding dawned on Mrs. Peterson's face. "Ah, a matrimonial arrangement." Margaret nodded, shame burning her cheeks. "Let me guess, Richard Tanner?" Margaret's head snapped up. "How did you know?" Mrs. Peterson sighed, shaking her head. "Third one this year. That man has more requirements for a wife than the Queen of England." and half the manners. She patted Margaret's hand. Don't you worry. His loss will be someone else's gain. The simple kindness broke something in Margaret. Tears spilled down her cheeks as the weight of her situation crashed over her. She had exactly $67 to her name. Her return ticket would cost nearly $50. And what waited for her in Boston? An empty apartment she'd given up? Friends who'd thrown her a farewell party? Certain she was leaving for married bliss? There now, Mrs. Peterson soothed, pressing a handkerchief into Margaret's hand. First tea, then a hot meal. After that, a good night's sleep. Things always look clearer in the morning light. Margaret followed her hostess to a small dining room where 3 other boarders, all men, looked up from their meal with curious expressions. Gentlemen, this is Miss Holloway, Mrs. Peterson announced. She'll be staying with us. I expect you all to show proper manners. The men nodded politely, though their eyes lingered a moment too long on Margaret's substantial figure. She was used to such looks, the quick assessment, the silent judgment. Miss Holloway came to be Richard Tanner's bride, Mrs. Peterson added, her tone sharp. But it seems Mr. Tanner has once again proven himself a fool. One of the men, older with a silver beard, snorted. Tanner wouldn't know a good woman if she baked him a pie and served it with a smile. Another, younger with spectacles perched on his nose, added. He's been strutting around town for months, bragging about his Boston lady coming to civilize him. The third man said nothing, but his dark eyes studied Margaret with something that wasn't quite pity. Eat, Mrs. Peterson urged, placing a bowl of stew before Margaret. Tomorrow's soon enough to decide what comes next. The stew was hearty, filled with chunks of beef and vegetables. Margaret hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first spoonful touched her lips. As she ate, she became aware of a commotion outside. Horses' hooves, men shouting. The third boarder rose and moved to the window. Fire at the Collins place, he announced. Looks bad. The men quickly excused themselves, hurrying out to help. Mrs. Peterson sighed. That's the 3rd fire this spring. Too many careless people. Too much dry timber. Margaret set down her spoon. Is there anything I can do to help? Mrs. Peterson's eyebrows rose in surprise. Most newcomers hide under their bed covers at their first frontier emergency. I'm not most newcomers, Margaret replied. After all, what did she have to lose now? Grab that shawl, Mrs. Peterson said, pointing to a hook by the door. The Collins have 3 little ones who'll need minding while their parents deal with the flames. As they hurried down the street toward a growing crowd, Margaret felt an odd sense of purpose replace her earlier despair. Richard Tanner might have rejected her, but perhaps Oak Ridge, Montana still held a place where she could be useful, even if only for a few days. What she couldn't know as she followed Mrs. Peterson toward the orange glow on the horizon was that the fire at the Collins farm would change her fate in ways she couldn't imagine, and that by this time tomorrow, she would face a choice that would forever alter the course of her life. Smoke stung Margaret's eyes as she wiped soot from a crying child's face. The Collins family had lost everything except the clothes on their backs. Their small farmhouse now stood as a blackened skeleton against the dawn sky. All night, the townspeople had fought the blaze, passing buckets of water in a human chain, but the dry timber had burned too quickly. You're a natural with children, Mrs. Peterson observed, handing Margaret a cup of coffee. They sat on the steps of the church, which had become an emergency shelter. Those little ones took to you right away. Margaret smiled tiredly. I've always loved children. I helped raise my younger brothers after my mother died. Nearby, the Collins family huddled together on a church pew, shell-shocked and exhausted. The oldest child, a girl of about 6, broke away and ran to Margaret, climbing into her lap without asking permission. Will you tell another story? The child asked, her small face streaked with tears and dirt. Sarah, don't bother the nice lady, Mrs. Collins called weakly. It's no bother, Margaret assured her, settling the child more comfortably. Once upon a time, there was a brave little girl who lived on the edge of a great forest. As Margaret spun a tale of courage and kindness, she became aware of being watched. A tall man stood in the church doorway, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the morning light. Unlike the other men, whose clothes showed evidence of firefighting, his shirt and trousers were clean, though his eyes looked as tired as everyone else's. "That's Daniel Grayson," Mrs. Peterson whispered when she noticed Margaret's glance. "Finest carpenter in the territory. He made half the furniture in town, including the church pews we're sitting on." "Why wasn't he fighting the fire?" Margaret asked. "He was, but differently. While the other men fought flames, Daniel built a barrier to save the Collins barn and livestock. Saved their livelihood, even if they lost their home." Mrs. Peterson's voice held unmistakable respect. "He's practical that way. Sees beyond the immediate crisis." The little girl had fallen asleep in Margaret's arms, her breathing deep and even despite the trauma of the night. Mrs. Collins approached, gratitude etched on her tired face. "Thank you for watching my children," she said softly. "My husband says we'll be staying with his brother until we can rebuild." As Margaret gently transferred the sleeping child to her mother's arms, she felt an unexpected pang. By this time tomorrow, she would be on a train heading east, away from this town where strangers helped each other through crisis, where a child could feel safe enough to sleep in the arms of someone she just met. "Miss Holloway?" Margaret looked up to find Daniel Grayson standing before her. Up close, she could see that his face was weathered from outdoor work, his eyes a startling blue against sun-browned skin. He held his hat in his hands, turning it slowly as if gathering his thoughts. "Mr. Grayson," Mrs. Peterson greeted him. "Have you met our newest arrival? This is Miss Margaret Holloway from Boston." "I haven't had the pleasure." His voice was deeper than she expected, with a hint of an accent she couldn't place. "Though I've heard your name mentioned." Margaret stiffened, certain he was referring to Richard's rejection. News indeed traveled fast in small towns. "Miss Holloway was a godsend with the Collins children," Mrs. Peterson continued, apparently oblivious to Margaret's discomfort. "Has a natural way with little ones." Daniel nodded, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "That's actually why I wanted to speak with you, Miss Holloway. I understand you're planning to return east." "Yes," Margaret confirmed, uncomfortable under his steady gaze. "The eastbound train leaves tomorrow afternoon. I'd like to discuss an alternative, if you're willing." He glanced at Mrs. Peterson. "Perhaps somewhere more private?" 10 minutes later, Margaret found herself seated in the pastor's study, a small room off the main church sanctuary. The morning light filtered through stained glass, casting colored patterns across the simple wooden desk. Daniel Grayson sat across from her, his large hands folded before him. "Mrs. Peterson says you're good with children," he began without preamble. "I enjoy their company," Margaret answered cautiously. "I have a daughter, Emma. She's 7. He spoke the words as if they explained everything. When Margaret remained silent, he continued. "Her mother died when she was 3. Influenza." "I'm sorry for your loss," Margaret said softly. "Emma needs a mother," he continued, "and I need help running the household. I'm away at the shop most days, and while my sister has been looking after Emma, she's expecting her own child now and can't continue." Margaret felt her chest tighten as his meaning became clear. "Mr. Grayson, are you proposing some sort of arrangement?" "I'm proposing marriage," he said bluntly. "Not a love match, but a practical partnership. You need a home and security. I need a mother for my child and someone to manage the household." Margaret stared at him, momentarily speechless. "You don't even know me." "I know enough. I know you traveled alone across the country showing courage. I know you didn't hesitate to help during a crisis. I know you're good with children." He paused. "And I know Richard Tanner is a fool who judges by appearance rather than character." Heat flooded Margaret's cheeks. "So you do know about that. Oak Ridge has fewer than 300 residents, Miss Holloway." "Yes, I heard." His expression softened slightly. I also heard you handled his rejection with dignity. Margaret couldn't help the bitter laugh that escaped her. Dignity is cold comfort when you've sold everything and traveled 1,000 miles based on false promises. I don't make false promises, Daniel said quietly. What I'm offering is honest work, a decent home, and respect. I can't offer romantic love, but I can promise fair treatment and security. And if I refuse, then you take the train tomorrow, and I wish you well. He spread his hands. I'm not trying to trap you, Miss Holloway. I'm offering an alternative to returning home in defeat. The word defeat stung with truth. What awaited her in Boston except pitying looks and whispers? At least here, her capabilities rather than her appearance seemed to matter. Your daughter, Margaret said slowly. Does she know about this proposition? Emma knows I'm looking for a mother for her. She doesn't know about you specifically. He hesitated. Would you like to meet her before deciding? Before Margaret could answer, a small whirlwind burst into the room. A thin girl with dark braids and her father's startling blue eyes.
Pa!
Mrs. Peterson said you were in here and… She stopped abruptly, noticing Margaret for the first time. Her eyes widened. Who are you? Emma, Daniel scolded gently. Where are your manners?
Sorry, Pa.
The girl made a clumsy curtsy.
I'm Emma Grayson.
Pleased to meet you. I'm Margaret Holloway, Margaret replied, fighting a smile at the child's directness. I'm visiting from Boston. Emma's face lit up. Boston? Like in the books? With big buildings and fancy parties? Yes, exactly like that. Do you know how to read? Emma asked eagerly. Pa reads to me, but he's always tired after work. Emma, Daniel warned. It's all right, Margaret assured him. She turned back to the girl. Yes, I know how to read. I used to teach reading, in fact. Emma bounced on her toes. Would you read to me, please? I have a new book about horses, but some of the words are too big. Margaret glanced at Daniel, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. I'd be happy to read to you, Emma. Perhaps after lunch. Yes. Emma clapped her hands, then suddenly grew serious. Are you going to be my new mother? The directness of the question startled both adults. Daniel cleared his throat. Emma, that's not. Because I've been praying for a mother, Emma continued, her small face earnest. One who knows how to read and doesn't mind my questions and maybe can teach me to bake cookies like Mrs. Peterson's. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. A warm, painful squeeze around her heart. This child wanted a mother so badly she'd accept a stranger simply on the hope of stories and cookies. Your father and I were just discussing possibilities, Margaret said carefully. Would you like to show me your book about horses? That might help me decide. Emma beamed, grabbing Margaret's hand without hesitation. It's at home, but Pa can take us there for lunch. Can't you, Pa? Daniel's expression was unreadable as he looked between his daughter and Margaret. If Miss Holloway is agreeable. I'd like to see your home, Margaret said, surprising herself with the truth of it. And I'd like to hear more about this arrangement you're suggesting. As they left the church, the morning sun finally broke fully through the clouds, casting golden light across the town. Margaret noticed for the first time the beauty of the mountains rising in the distance, the clean sweep of prairie grasses bending in the breeze. Emma skipped ahead, chattering about her horsebook and her room and how she hoped Margaret liked chicken stew because that's what they had left from yesterday's supper. She's taken with you already, Daniel observed quietly, walking beside Margaret. Children are often quick to form attachments, Margaret replied, but they can be just as quick to change their minds. Not Emma. She knows her own mind. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Like her mother. The mention of his late wife sent an unexpected pang through Margaret. Tell me about her, she said impulsively. The woman whose place you're asking me to take. Daniel was silent for several steps. Catherine was born here in Oak Ridge. We grew up together, married young. She was small, quick, always laughing. His voice held warmth but not the raw pain of recent grief. She would have hated how quiet our house has become. They turned onto a side street lined with modest homes, each with a small yard. At the end stood a two-story house painted blue, with a workshop attached to one side. A large oak tree shaded the front yard, where wildflowers grew in cheerful disarray. "It's lovely," Margaret said sincerely. "It needs a woman's touch," Daniel replied. "Catherine's flowers are all that remain of her hand here." As they approached the gate, Margaret suddenly stopped. "Mr. Grayson, why me? There must be women in town who would." "There are," he interrupted, "and every one of them sees me as a path to security or status. They want the carpenter with a prospering business, not the man with the grief and the too serious child." He met her eyes directly. "You need a fresh start. I need someone who understands loss." It seemed fitting. Before Margaret could respond, Emma called from the porch, "Hurry up! I'm hungry and Miss Holloway still has to read my horse book." As Margaret followed Daniel up the path, she wondered if she was walking toward another rejection or something she hadn't dared hope for, a place where she might truly belong. A single tear splashed onto Margaret's sleeve as the strange man stood in Mrs. Peterson's cramped sitting room. The clock ticked loudly in the silence between them. "My name is Daniel Grayson," he said, removing his worn hat. "I own the carpentry shop near the creek." Margaret gripped her handkerchief tightly. "Have you come to stare at the woman too large for marriage?" Her voice cracked despite her effort to sound strong. Daniel's eyes widened with surprise. They were the deepest blue she'd ever seen, like the ocean she'd watched from Boston Harbor. Unlike most people who looked at her, his gaze stayed on her face. "No, ma'am," he replied softly. "I've come because I need help, and Mrs. Peterson says you might need a fresh start." The grandfather clock chimed 4 times, making Margaret jump. Outside, children shouted as they played in the dusty street. Inside the stuffy room, her future hung in the balance. "I have a daughter," Daniel continued, his rough hands fidgeting with his hat brim. "Emma. She's 7 now and growing like a wildflower without any guidance. My wife Sarah passed during a fever outbreak 2 winters ago." Margaret's chest tightened. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Mr. Grayson, but I don't understand why you're telling me this." Daniel straightened his shoulders. "Miss Holloway, I need someone to care for Emma while I run my business. The shop is doing well. I make furniture that ships as far as Denver, but I can't be both mother and father while earning our living." A tiny spark of hope flickered in Margaret's chest, but she quickly extinguished it. "And what exactly are you proposing, sir?" "A partnership," he said plainly. "Not a love match, but something honest. You'd have your own room, of course. Emma needs mothering, the house needs tending, and I need peace of mind." Margaret's fingers found her silver pendant, the last gift from her mother before consumption took her. "You know what happened with Mr. Tanner? How he rejected me the moment he saw me." Daniel's face darkened like a thundercloud. "Richard Tanner wouldn't recognize true worth if it built his house and cooked his meals. That man measures everything by appearances." A knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Peterson poked her head in. "Tea's ready if you'd like some." "Thank you," Margaret said, grateful for the moment to collect her thoughts. Daniel waited until Mrs. Peterson left before speaking again. "Miss Holloway, I won't pretend this is romantic, but in time, I believe respect can grow into something meaningful." Margaret poured tea with shaking hands. "And if the arrangement doesn't suit either of us? Then I'll ensure you have means to return east or settle elsewhere," he answered without hesitation. "I'm not offering charity, Miss Holloway. I'm offering fair exchange. Your skills for security." The tea was weak but warm. Margaret sipped it slowly, studying the man across from her. His clothes were clean but worn at the edges. His beard was neatly trimmed, his posture straight despite obvious fatigue in the lines around his eyes. "Why not hire a housekeeper, or remarry properly?" she asked. Daniel's smile was sad. "Housekeepers come and go. Emma needs stability. And as for remarrying, he looked out the window. Matching hearts takes time I don't have. A sudden commotion outside drew their attention. Through the lace curtains, Margaret saw a small girl with dark braids chasing a puppy across the street. The child's laughter rang out clear as a bell. "Is that Emma?" Daniel confirmed, his face softening. "She's supposed to be with the blacksmith's wife, but she sneaks away." Pride and exasperation mingled in his voice. Margaret watched the girl corral the puppy with determined little hands. Something stirred within her, a feeling she'd almost forgotten existed. "She's very spirited," Margaret observed. "Too spirited sometimes," Daniel sighed. "She needs gentle guidance, not just my fumbling attempts." Emma spotted her father through the window and waved excitedly. Daniel waved back, then turned to Margaret with unexpected intensity. "Before you answer, there's something else you should know. People will talk. They always do in small towns. They'll say unkind things about why I chose you." The familiar hurt rose in Margaret's throat. "Because no one else would have me." "No," Daniel said firmly. "Because they're small-minded fools who can't see beyond their own narrow views. I'm offering this arrangement because Mrs. Peterson says you're kind, educated, and capable. Nothing more, nothing less." As he rose to leave, Daniel reached into his pocket and placed a small wooden box on the table between them. Its surface was polished to a warm glow, intricate leaves carved around the edges. "Emma made me promise to give you this. She picked it herself, though I did the carving." Margaret opened the box slowly. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft cloth, lay a perfect wooden bluebird, its wings spread as if caught mid-flight. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each feather distinct, the tiny eyes bright with life. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Emma says bluebirds bring happiness," Daniel explained, moving toward the door. "We could use some of that, Miss Holloway. Think about my offer. We live in the White House past the mill if you decide to accept." After he left, Margaret held the bluebird in her palm, its wooden form warm against her skin. Through the window, she watched Daniel lift Emma onto his shoulders, the child's delighted squeal reaching her even through the glass. For the first time since stepping off the train, Margaret felt something other than shame and regret. Not hope, she dared not name it that, but perhaps possibility. The smell of burning bread yanked Margaret from her daydream. She rushed to the oven, grabbing a thick cloth to pull out the blackened loaf. "Oh no!" she cried, waving away smoke that curled toward the ceiling. 1 week in the Grayson home, and already she'd ruined breakfast. Emma appeared in the doorway, her small feet bare despite the morning chill. "Is the house on fire?" she asked, eyes wide with excitement rather than fear. "Just the bread, dear," Margaret sighed, setting the burnt loaf on the windowsill. "I'm afraid I was thinking too hard and forgot to watch the time." "Pa says thinking too hard is a good problem," Emma declared, climbing onto a chair to peer at the ruined bread. "He says most folks don't think enough." Margaret couldn't help smiling. "Your father is a wise man, but he might be less wise when he discovers we have no bread for breakfast." Emma's face brightened. "We could have flapjacks instead. Sarah, that's my first mother, used to make them with blueberries when something went wrong." The casual mention of Daniel's late wife sent a ripple of unease through Margaret. She'd been sleeping in Sarah Grayson's bed, cooking in her kitchen, caring for her child. The ghost of the woman seemed to hover in corners, watching. "Flapjacks it is," Margaret agreed, reaching for the flour canister. "Would you like to help?" Emma nodded eagerly, and soon they were working side by side, flour dusting their aprons as Margaret showed the girl how to test the griddle with water droplets. "You do it different than Sarah," Emma observed, watching Margaret flip a perfectly golden cake. "But I think I like your way too." The simple words eased something tight in Margaret's chest. "We can remember Sarah's ways and still make new traditions together," she offered carefully. Emma considered this, her small face serious. Like how Pa keeps Sarah's picture on his desk, but built new shelves for your books? Exactly like that, Margaret agreed, touched that Daniel had noticed her love of reading. The back door creaked open, and Daniel entered, sawdust clinging to his clothes, the scent of pine following him. He stopped short at the sight of them, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, then something softer. "Smells better in here than it did 10 minutes ago," he said with a gentle smile. "I was worried we might have to call the fire brigade." "Margaret burned the bread," Emma announced happily. "So we're making flapjack Sarah's way, but with Margaret's special flip." Daniel's eyes met Margaret's over his daughter's head, a silent understanding passing between them. "The best of both worlds," he said quietly. After breakfast, Margaret scrubbed dishes while Emma scampered outside to feed the chickens. Through the window, she watched Daniel move across the yard toward his workshop, pausing to swing his daughter in a circle that made her squeal with delight. The scene made Margaret's heart ache in a way she couldn't quite name. This arrangement, this temporary solution, was beginning to feel dangerously comfortable. A sudden knock at the front door startled her from her thoughts. "You who? Margaret, are you at home?" called a familiar voice. Mrs. Peterson stood on the porch, a wicker basket over her arm. "I've brought those cuttings I promised for your garden," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Her sharp eyes took in the homey kitchen. "My, you've brightened this place up. Daniel must be pleased." "I hope so," Margaret replied, drying her hands on her apron. "Would you like some coffee? It's fresh." Mrs. Peterson settled at the table, her expression suddenly serious. "Actually, I came to warn you. Gossip's flying since you moved in here. Richard Tanner's bride-to-be arrived yesterday on the afternoon train. A tiny little thing from Denver. Pretty as a picture, they say, and half your size." Margaret's stomach clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "I wish them every happiness." "Shaw!" Mrs. Peterson waved dismissively. "That man doesn't deserve happiness after how he treated you. But that's not my point. His new lady has been asking questions about you and Daniel." Stirring the pot. The coffee pot bubbled on the stove, suddenly too loud in the quiet kitchen. "What kind of questions? Whether you and Daniel are properly married or just—" Mrs. Peterson hesitated. "Living in sin, as they say." Heat flooded Margaret's face. "Our arrangement is perfectly respectable. I have my own room, and Daniel has been nothing but honorable. You and I know that," Mrs. Peterson nodded. "But small towns feed on scandal. I just wanted you prepared before Sunday services. People will be watching." After Mrs. Peterson left, Margaret leaned against the closed door, her thoughts racing. She hadn't considered how their arrangement would appear to others. In her relief at finding a solution, she'd overlooked the potential for new humiliation. That evening, as Emma slept and crickets sang outside the open windows, Margaret sat darning socks by lamplight. Daniel entered quietly, carrying a fresh cup of tea for her. "You're troubled," he said, settling into the chair opposite. It wasn't a question. Margaret set aside her mending. "Mrs. Peterson visited today. She says people are talking about us. About our arrangement." Daniel's face hardened slightly. "I expected as much. Does it bother you?" "Not for myself," she answered honestly. "I'm used to judgment. But Emma? And your business? Emma adores you already," Daniel interrupted gently. "And anyone who would boycott my furniture over town gossip isn't worth my concern." The lamplight caught the silver threads in his dark beard. Margaret noticed how his hands, always in motion during daylight hours, now rested calmly on his knees. "There is a solution," he said after a long moment. "We could make this arrangement permanent. Legal." Margaret's heart stumbled. "You mean marriage?" "Yes," he said simply. "A true partnership, but with the protection of vows." "Based on practicality," Margaret clarified, her voice barely audible over the pounding in her ears. Daniel leaned forward, his gaze intent. "Based on what's growing between us, Margaret." Don't tell me you don't feel it too. Before she could answer, a small voice called from the stairway. Papa, I had the dream again. Emma stood clutching her doll, tears streaking her cheeks. Daniel rose immediately, but Margaret was quicker, gathering the child against her ample body. The one about the dark river? She asked softly, having heard Emma's night terrors before. Emma nodded against her shoulder, small fingers gripping Margaret's nightdress. Will you tell me the story about the brave little boat again? Margaret led her back upstairs, aware of Daniel watching them from below. The story, one Margaret had invented 3 nights ago during another bad dream, seemed to calm Emma like nothing else. Later, returning downstairs, she found Daniel waiting. The question hung unspoken between them. I need time, she whispered. This is all happening so quickly. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Take all the time you need. We aren't going anywhere. The next morning dawned with dark clouds gathering on the horizon. Margaret hurried to take down laundry from the line before rain could soak it. As she reached for a pillowcase flapping in the rising wind, a voice called from the road. Mrs. Grayson, a moment of your time. Pastor Miller stood at the gate, his round face concerned beneath his hat. Margaret hesitated. She wasn't Mrs. Grayson, but correcting a pastor seemed impertinent. Good morning, Pastor, she called, approaching with her basket. Daniel is in his workshop if you're looking for him. Actually, it's you I wanted to speak with, the pastor said, his voice lowered despite there being no one to overhear them. There have been concerns raised about your living arrangement here. The first fat raindrops began to fall as Margaret's world tilted sideways once again. Blood rushed to Margaret's face as she stood frozen in the middle of Main Street. Richard Tanner, the man who had rejected her 3 months ago, was walking straight toward her with a thin woman on his arm. There was no alley to duck into, no shop to hide in. The basket of fresh eggs and flour she'd just purchased suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Well, look who's still in town, Richard called out, loud enough for the Saturday shoppers to hear. I figured you'd have run back east by now. The woman beside him, clearly his new bride, wore a pale pink dress that matched the ribbons in her bonnet. She looked Margaret up and down with curious eyes. Is this her, Richard? The woman whispered, not quietly enough. Margaret's fingers tightened around the basket handle. 3 months of helping Daniel raise Emma, of cooking meals and tending the vegetable garden, of finding her place in this town had changed her. The old Margaret might have lowered her eyes and hurried away, but not today. Mr. Tanner, she said with a nod. How nice to see you settled. She smiled at the new Mrs. Tanner, whose cheeks turned the same shade as her ribbons. Richard's jaw tightened. Clara, this is Miss Holloway, the one I told you about. His eyes narrowed. I'm surprised Grayson keeps you around. Most men want a proper wife, not a what, Mr. Tanner? Margaret cut in, her voice steady though her heart hammered in her chest. The street seemed to quiet as shoppers paused to watch. Mrs. Peterson emerged from the millinery shop, her eyes wide with concern. 2 men stopped loading crates into a wagon. Even old Mr. Wilkins, who was half-deaf, turned to listen. A woman who knows her own mind? A woman who can manage a household and help raise a child? Margaret continued, surprising herself with each word. Or perhaps you meant a woman who doesn't match your narrow idea of beauty. Clara Tanner's mouth fell open. Richard's face darkened like a thundercloud. You've got some nerve, he spat. I saved you from humiliation by ending our arrangement privately. I could have left you stranded at the station for all to see. Margaret set her basket down on the boardwalk. You did me a favor, though you didn't mean to. For the first time, she truly believed these words. Your rejection led me to a better man and a better life. Richard scoffed. Daniel Grayson was always second-rate, even before his wife died. You two make a fitting pair, the crippled carpenter and his oversized housekeeper. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. Everyone in town knew Daniel's slight limp came from saving 2 children from a collapsed mine 3 years back. Richard, please. Clara tugged at his sleeve, looking mortified. But Richard was on a roll now, puffed up with the attention. Tell me, Miss Holloway, what exactly are you to Grayson? Not his wife, surely. The arrangement must be convenient for a lonely widower. The cruel implication hung in the air. Margaret's cheeks burned, but rage replaced embarrassment. This man had not only insulted her but Daniel, good, kind Daniel, who had never treated her as anything less than precious. Mr. Tanner seems concerned about my living situation, Mrs. Peterson, Margaret called to the landlady, who now stood with hands on her hips. Perhaps you could enlighten him about the separate bedrooms at the Grayson home, since town gossip is apparently what interests him most. Mrs. Peterson nodded firmly. Separate rooms indeed. And Emma Grayson never had a better mother figure. Richard wasn't finished. He stepped closer, jabbing a finger toward Margaret. You think you've found your place here? Everyone knows Grayson took you in out of pity. You should be on your knees thanking. A strong hand caught Richard's wrist mid-jab. Daniel stood there, his blue eyes cold as winter ice. No one had noticed him approaching from his woodshop down the street. That's enough, Daniel said quietly. The controlled fury in his voice made the crowd step back. You will not speak to my wife that way. Wife. The word echoed in the sudden silence of the street. Margaret's heart stopped, then raced ahead. They had never discussed marriage, never moved beyond their practical arrangement. Yet here was Daniel, claiming her before the entire town. Richard snatched his hand away, rubbing his wrist. Wife, that's rich. Everyone knows you haven't been to see Pastor Miller. What happens between Margaret and me is our business, Daniel replied. But know this, she is my family now. Disrespect her again, and you'll answer to me. Clara tugged urgently at Richard's arm. Richard, please let's go. For a moment it seemed Richard might push further. Then something in Daniel's stance, the set of his shoulders, the firm plant of his feet, made him reconsider. Come, Clara, he muttered. We're wasting time with these people. As they walked away, Daniel turned to Margaret. His expression softened as he carefully picked up her basket. Are you all right? He asked softly, though his free hand was still clenched in a fist at his side. Margaret became aware of the crowd still watching, of Mrs. Peterson's knowing smile, of the whispers already spreading. Her cheeks burned anew, but not from shame. You called me your wife, she said, too quietly for others to hear. Daniel's eyes widened slightly, as if he'd only just realized what he'd done. A flush crept up his neck. Aye, the eggs might break if we stand here too long, Margaret interrupted, not ready for whatever he might say next. Not here in the middle of town with 24 pairs of eyes on them. Daniel nodded, understanding in his gaze. He offered his arm, and she took it, the touch sending warmth through her body despite the summer heat already baking the dusty street. They walked home in silence, the air between them charged with unspoken words. The basket hung from Daniel's arm, the eggs miraculously intact despite the morning's upheaval. At the gate to their home, no, Daniel's home, Margaret corrected herself. Emma came running out, her dark braids flying behind her. Bah! Miss Margaret, you'll never guess what I found in the garden. She skidded to a halt, eyes darting between them. Even at 7, she was perceptive enough to sense the tension. Is something wrong? Margaret and Daniel exchanged a glance. Something had changed today. A line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Whether for better or worse remained to be seen. Nothing's wrong, sweet pea, Daniel assured his daughter. What did you find? As Emma chattered about a bird's nest hidden in the bean poles, Margaret watched Daniel's face. The gentle curve of his smile, the crinkles beside his eyes, the strength in his jawline. Wife, he had called her. The word hummed in her bones like a struck tuning fork, both thrilling and terrifying. What came next? And why, despite her fear, did she find herself hoping he had meant it? Thunder cracked outside the window as Margaret's hands trembled around the china teacup. The storm had rolled in suddenly, matching the turmoil inside the Grayson home. For hours, She and Daniel had moved around each other like wary cats, speaking only when necessary, their words clipped and careful. Emma had noticed, her bright eyes darting between them during supper until Daniel had sent her to practice her reading in her room. "It's going to rain for days," Daniel said, breaking the heavy silence as he stared out the kitchen window. His shoulders looked tight beneath his cotton shirt. Margaret nodded, though he couldn't see the gesture. "The garden will drown if it keeps up." More silence. The clock ticked. Rain lashed against the glass. "Why did you say it?" The question burst from Margaret's lips before she could stop it. "In town today. Why did you call me that?" Daniel turned, his face half in shadow from the lamp's glow. Lightning flashed, illuminating the struggle in his eyes. "Your wife," Margaret clarified, setting down the teacup before she dropped it. "You called me your wife." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, musing the dark waves she'd secretly admired for months. "It just came out." "Things don't just come out, Daniel." Margaret stood, needing to move. "Not words like that." Another crack of thunder shook the house. Somewhere upstairs, a door opened, and Emma's voice called down, "Pa? Is everything okay?" "Fine, Emma," Daniel called back, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "The storm's just loud. Go back to your book." They waited, listening to the creak of floorboards as Emma retreated. When Daniel spoke again, his voice was low, forcing Margaret to step closer to hear him over the rain. "When I saw Tanner speaking to you that way," his fists clenched at his sides, "something snapped in me." "Anger," Margaret nodded. "He was being horrible." "Not just anger." Daniel shook his head. "Fear." That stopped her. "Fear? Of what?" "That you'd believe him." Daniel's eyes found hers, startlingly vulnerable. "That you'd start thinking maybe he was right, that I took you in from pity, that you should be grateful. That you'd look at our life together and see only an arrangement instead of what it's become." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. "What has it become, Daniel?" He moved toward her then, stopping an arm's length away. "You know," he said softly. "I don't," she insisted, though hope fluttered dangerously in her chest. "Our agreement was clear. You needed help with Emma and the house. I needed somewhere to belong. Is that still all you want? Somewhere to belong?" His voice roughened. "Because I want more, Margaret. I've wanted more since the second week you were here." The memory rushed back, him finding her in the kitchen at dawn, flour on her cheeks, humming as she kneaded bread dough. The way he'd stopped in the doorway, staring as if he'd never seen her before. "What happened the second week?" she asked, barely breathing. "You laughed," he said simply, "at some silly joke Emma told. And I realized I'd never heard that sound before, your real laugh. It hit me like a physical blow. How much I wanted to hear it again and again." Margaret's eyes burned with unshed tears. "Daniel, let me finish," he pleaded. "I've been a coward, hiding behind our arrangement because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" Her voice was almost a whisper now. "That someone like you, educated, cultured, couldn't possibly want someone like me. A simple carpenter with a limp and a failing business and a daughter who still cries for her mother sometimes." Margaret's breath caught. "Someone like me? Daniel, you took me in when the whole town knew I'd been rejected for being too fat. Is that what you think?" Daniel stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his blue eyes. "That I offered you a home despite how you look?" She nodded, confusion creasing her brow. "Margaret Holloway," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I have thanked God every day that Richard Tanner was too blind to see your beauty." The tears spilled over then, tracking warm paths down her cheeks. "Don't say such things if you don't mean them." "I mean every word." His calloused hand lifted, hesitating near her face as if asking permission. When she didn't pull away, he gently wiped a tear with his thumb. "Your eyes that change color with your mood. Your hands that can knead bread and bandage skinned knees and turn the pages of a book with equal care. Your smile that you used to hide behind your hand until Emma told you it was too pretty to cover up. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, something warm and bright was building in Margaret's chest. I called you my wife today because in my heart, that's what you already are, Daniel continued. Not because of some legal paper or ceremony, but because I love you, Margaret. I love your mind and your heart and your courage and your body. All of you. And if you don't feel the same, I'll never mention it again. We can go on as before. But I couldn't let another day pass without telling you the truth. Margaret stood perfectly still, afraid that if she moved, she might discover this was all a dream. 3 months ago, she'd arrived in Montana believing no man would ever see past her size to her heart. Now here stood Daniel Grayson. Good, honorable Daniel, offering her everything she'd stopped believing she deserved. Say something, he whispered, even if it's goodbye. I don't want an arrangement anymore, she said finally. Daniel's face fell, his hand dropping away from her cheek. He nodded once, a sharp jerk of his chin. I understand. No, you don't. Margaret stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Her hands found his rough palm against soft. I want a marriage, a real one. Hope bloomed across his features. Margaret, I love you too, she said, the words feeling like a homecoming. I love your patience and your strength and the way you look at me like I'm precious instead of too much. I love how you treat Emma and how you hum when you work and how you always save the last biscuit for me even though I know they're your favorite. A laugh, part joy, part relief, escaped him. His hands tightened around hers. Are you saying yes? To what? She teased. You haven't actually asked me anything. Daniel dropped to one knee right there on the kitchen floor, still holding her hands. Rain pounded the roof, and somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked as Emma undoubtedly listened at her door. Margaret Holloway, Daniel said, his voice steady and sure. Will you marry me? Not for convenience or propriety, but because I love you and want to spend my life showing you how beautiful you are to me. Margaret's heart felt too big for her chest, expanding with a joy she'd never thought possible. Yes, she whispered, then louder, yes. Daniel stood and pulled her into his arms. His embrace felt like shelter from every storm she'd ever weathered. When his lips found hers, tentative at first, then with growing confidence, Margaret understood what all the poetry had been trying to tell her. This was worth every mile traveled, every tear shed, every moment of doubt. They broke apart at the sound of a squeal from the staircase. Emma stood there in her nightgown, eyes wide with delight. Are you really going to be my mother now? She asked, bouncing on her toes. For real and true? Margaret opened her arm, keeping the other around Daniel's waist. For real and true. Come here, sweet girl. Emma flew down the remaining stairs and into their embrace. As the three of them stood there, arms entwined while thunder rolled overhead, Margaret realized she'd found something greater than acceptance. She'd found belonging, not as an arrangement or compromise, but as the most genuine form of love. I think this calls for hot chocolate, Daniel murmured against her hair. Storm or no storm, we're celebrating tonight. As he moved to stoke the kitchen fire and Emma chattered excitedly about what she would wear to the wedding, Margaret touched her fingers to her lips, still warm from Daniel's kiss. For the first time in her life, she didn't worry about taking up too much space in the world. Here, in this kitchen with these two people, her size was exactly right. Big enough to hold all the love she felt and all that was given in return. The church bell's broken clapper made a dull thunk instead of a proper ring, startling Margaret as she stood frozen behind the closed doors. Her new dress of deep blue silk, a fabric she'd once believed women of her size shouldn't wear, suddenly felt too tight around her chest. What if everyone was laughing behind those doors? What if Daniel had changed his mind? You're white as fresh laundry, dear, Mrs. Peterson whispered, adjusting the wildflowers Emma had tucked into Margaret's hair that morning. Cold feet. Before Margaret could answer, a crack appeared in the church door, and Emma's face peeked through. Her missing front tooth made her excited smile even more endearing. "Pa sent me to check if you ran away," the little girl announced loudly enough for the waiting congregation to hear. "He's sweating buckets, and Mr. Jenkins bet him $2 you'd take the morning stage to Helena." Scattered laughter erupted from inside, breaking the tension. Margaret knelt to Emma's level, not caring if her dress wrinkled. "Does your father really think I'd leave?" she asked softly. Emma shook her head, her eyes serious. "No, but he says good things don't usually happen to Graysons, so he's scared." Something warm unfurled in Margaret's chest. Daniel was afraid too, afraid of losing her, not embarrassed by her, not settling for her, but afraid she was too good for him. "Well then," Margaret said, standing tall, "we'd better prove him wrong about Grayson luck, shouldn't we?" When the doors finally opened, Margaret didn't walk. She strode, her head high. The small church was packed to the rafters. Miners stood shoulder to shoulder with ranchers. Women who'd once whispered behind their hands now smiled openly. Mrs. Miller from the bakery dabbed at her eyes with a flour-dusted handkerchief. Sheriff Donovan had polished his badge for the occasion. And there at the altar stood Daniel, his Sunday suit freshly pressed, his beard neatly trimmed. The moment their eyes locked, everything else faded. His hands trembled as she approached, and somehow that small sign of nervousness steadied her completely. "You came," he whispered, voice rough with emotion. "Wild horses couldn't have kept me away," she replied. The ceremony blurred into a haze of happiness, though Margaret would always remember how Pastor Wilson stumbled over the word obedience and glanced nervously at her, as if expecting argument. She would remember Emma standing so close that the child nearly wedged herself between them during the vows. And she would forever remember how Daniel's voice never wavered when he promised to cherish her all the days of his life. When Pastor Wilson pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that rose from the congregation rattled the windows. Daniel swept her into a kiss that started proper but quickly forgot itself, causing Emma to giggle and Mrs. Peterson to clear her throat loudly. Outside, sunshine bathed the church steps as townsfolk lined up to congratulate them. Margaret's hand hadn't left Daniel since the ceremony. Their fingers intertwined so tightly it was hard to tell where one began and the other ended. "Mrs. Grayson," called Mrs. Jenkins, presenting a covered dish. "My special pickle recipe. The secret to a happy marriage. Is the secret that they taste so awful nobody has energy to quarrel?" Sheriff Donovan teased, dodging Mrs. Jenkins' swat. Amid the laughter and well wishes, Margaret spotted a figure hanging back at the edge of the crowd. Richard Tanner stood stiffly beside his thin wife, whose pinched expression suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. For a heartbeat, the old shame threatened to return, but then Emma tugged at Margaret's skirt. "Ma," she said, testing the word as if tasting sugar for the first time. "Ma, can we go to the party now? I'm starving." The simple word, "Ma," washed away any lingering doubt. This was her family. This was her home. As they turned to head toward the town hall where tables groaned under the weight of the wedding feast, Margaret caught Richard's eye one last time. He quickly looked away, unable to hold her gaze. His rejection, once so devastating, now seemed like a gift. Without it, she might never have found this. The celebration spilled from the town hall into the street as afternoon stretched into evening. Margaret danced with Daniel beneath paper lanterns, their shadows merging on the wooden boards. She danced with Emma standing on her feet. She even danced with old Mr. Calloway, who told her in a whiskey-scented whisper that she was the finest thing to happen to Oak Ridge since they struck silver in '78. As twilight deepened, Daniel found her sitting on a bench, watching Emma play tag with the other children. "Happy?" he asked, sliding beside her. "Beyond words," she answered truthfully. He took her hand, turning it to reveal the simple gold band that now circled her finger. "I have something else for you, a proper wedding gift." From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet pouch. Inside nestled a locket on a delicate chain, not new, but polished to a soft glow. When opened, it revealed a tiny portrait of Emma on one side. The other side was empty. "For our future," Daniel explained, his voice hushed. "Our family." The word family hung between them, full of promise and possibility. "When I arrived in Oak Ridge," Margaret said, watching Emma chase fireflies in the gathering darkness, "I thought I knew what I wanted. A husband. Security." She touched the locket gently. "I never dreamed I'd find a home for my heart." As the dancing continued behind them and stars began to appear overhead, Daniel leaned close and whispered, "Welcome home, Mrs. Grayson." And in that perfect moment, Margaret knew that sometimes the longest journeys end exactly where we're meant to be all along. A piercing scream tore through the pre-dawn darkness, jolting Margaret from deep sleep. She fumbled for matches, heart hammering against her ribs as she lit the bedside lamp. The empty space beside her confirmed Daniel had already rushed to Emma's room. "No, don't take her too." Emma's terrified voice echoed down the hallway. Margaret hurried barefoot across cold floorboards, the February chill seeping through her nightgown. In Emma's room, Daniel sat on the edge of the small bed, cradling his shaking daughter. "It's all right, sweetheart," he murmured. "Just a bad dream." Emma's tear-streaked face appeared over Daniel's shoulder, her eyes finding Margaret in the doorway. The raw fear there made Margaret's throat tighten. "I dreamed you got sick like Mama did," Emma hiccuped, reaching for Margaret with trembling hands. "You wouldn't wake up and they put you in the ground and Pa cried for days and days just like before." Daniel's face went rigid at the mention of his first wife's death, a topic rarely discussed in their household. The consumption that took Sarah Grayson 4 winters ago had left wounds that still ached, especially in the heart of her daughter. "Oh, my darling girl," Margaret said, crossing to the bed and gathering both Emma and Daniel into her arms. "I'm right here, strong as an ox, your father says." Emma's small fingers clutched Margaret's nightgown. "Promise you won't leave?" The simple question held the weight of the child's entire world. Margaret met Daniel's eyes over Emma's head, seeing his own unspoken fear reflected there. "I promise to do everything in my power to stay right here with you both," Margaret answered carefully. "Some things we can't control, but I'll never willingly leave you." They stayed tangled together until Emma's breathing slowed back to sleep. As they tiptoed back to their bedroom, Daniel caught Margaret's hand. "Sarah's birthday would have been tomorrow," he said quietly. "I should have warned you Emma might have nightmares." The admission that he still remembered his first wife's birthday didn't sting as it might have months ago. Instead, Margaret felt a surge of tenderness for this man who loved so deeply that loss had nearly broken him. "We'll do something special tomorrow," she suggested, "to honor her memory." Daniel's surprise was visible even in the dim hallway. "You'd do that?" "Sarah gave Emma life," Margaret said simply, "and she loved you both first. That deserves remembering." The next morning dawned bright and brittle cold. Margaret rose early to bake cinnamon rolls. Emma had once mentioned they were her mother's specialty. When Daniel entered the kitchen and smelled the familiar aroma, his eyes widened in recognition before filling with tears. He quickly blinked away. "You didn't have to do this," he said hoarsely. "Family remembers family," Margaret replied, squeezing his rough hand. After breakfast, they bundled against the cold and walked to the small cemetery on the hill overlooking town. Margaret had picked pine branches and winterberries to place on Sarah's grave. Emma skipped ahead, her earlier nightmare seemingly forgotten in the bright winter sunshine. At the gravesite, Daniel stood silent while Emma chattered to the headstone, telling her mother about school and her new puppy and how Margaret had taught her to make bread. Margaret hung back, giving them privacy, until Emma waved her forward insistently. "Mama would like you," Emma declared with childish certainty. "She always said Pa needed someone who wouldn't let him be grumpy." Daniel made a choked sound that might have been a laugh. "She did say that." On the walk home, Emma ran ahead to greet neighbors, leaving Daniel and Margaret alone. "Thank you," he said, his breath clouding in the winter air. "Most women wouldn't understand." Margaret thought about jealousy and insecurity, emotions she'd once been so familiar with. Love isn't smaller for being shared, she said. It grows. By mid-afternoon, heavy clouds had gathered, promising snow. Margaret stood at her favorite window watching flakes begin to swirl, a steaming cup of tea warming her hands. From here, she could see the workshop where Daniel crafted furniture now famous throughout the territory. Near the fence, a snow woman of impressive proportions stood guardian. Emma's tribute to her new mother completed the previous weekend. The wooden bluebird, her first gift from them, now perched above the mantel of their home, a reminder of how far they'd come. Daniel's workshop door opened, releasing a cloud of sawdust into the winter air. He trudged through deepening snow toward the house, his shoulders dusted white. Something in his purposeful stride made Margaret smile. 6 months married, and still her heart quickened at the sight of him. The door opened, bringing a blast of cold air and Daniel's larger-than-life presence into the kitchen. He stamped snow from his boots and hung his coat before turning to her with an expression that made her pause. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "Mrs. Lawrence came to order a cradle," he said carefully. "Made me think." Margaret set down her teacup, suddenly understanding his hesitation. They hadn't spoken of children, their own children, though the subject hovered unspoken between them. "And what did you think?" she prompted gently. Daniel crossed to her, taking her hands in his still cold ones. "I thought how beautiful you'd look with our baby in your arms." The words unlocked something inside Margaret, a longing she'd never allowed herself to acknowledge. In Boston, pregnancy had seemed a distant dream, reserved for women unlike her. Even after marrying Daniel, she'd been cautious about hoping for too much happiness. "Are you asking if I want a child?" she whispered. "I'm asking if you want to try for one," he answered, his voice husky. "Emma's been praying for a brother or sister since Christmas." Joy bubbled up inside her, threatening to overflow. Has she? MMHM. And you know I can deny my girls nothing." As if summoned by her name, Emma burst through the front door in a flurry of snow and excitement. "It's snowing hard. Can we make popcorn and tell stories by the fire like last time?" Daniel scooped her up, twirling her until she shrieked with laughter. "Anything for you, princess. Why don't you fetch the popcorn pan while I build up the fire?" As Emma scampered to the pantry, Daniel pulled Margaret close, his lips brushing her ear. "We'll continue our discussion later," he promised, his meaning unmistakable. Later, with Emma asleep and snow falling thick outside their bedroom window, Daniel traced the curves of Margaret's body with reverent hands. "A penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Grayson," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her shoulder. "I was thinking about measurement," she replied, turning to face him. "How we measure worth. How I once believed mine could be calculated in inches and pounds." His strong arms encircled her protectively. "And now," Margaret framed his beloved face between her hands. "Now I know better. Worth isn't weighed on scales or reflected in mirrors. It's measured in courage, in kindness, in love given and received." Through the window, she could see snowflakes dancing in the moonlight. Beyond lay the town of Oak Ridge, no longer a place of judgment but of belonging. "I came here seeking acceptance," Margaret whispered against his lips. "But what I needed was to accept myself." Daniel gathered her closer, his kiss tender yet promising passion to come. "Your arrival changed everything," he said. "You remade our world." As sleep finally claimed them both, Margaret's last conscious thought was a correction to his words. They had remade each other. A family fashioned not from conventional expectations but from the raw materials of honesty, courage, and love. Their imperfect hearts had found their perfect home. A truth measured not in rings or vows or even children yet to come, but in the quiet certainty that whatever storms life might bring, they would weather them together.